All right, looks like we're recording. And guys, I am so thrilled and honored to have on the program Dr. Richard Ryder. And Richard, I've been learning more about you in the past few months, and I don't think I'm being hyperbolic when I would say that I probably wouldn't be doing what I'm doing if not for your influence. I hope that people will start to understand that as we have this conversation. I know that you're most famously known for coining the term speciesism. I kind of want to get into the notion that in some cases, in myself included, uh, that can be somewhat dismissive because that kind of like the way I've seen it, that kind of makes you seem like a footnote and kind of doesn't capture how influential you were in getting all this kind of started with the modern animal rights movement. So first, let me just welcome you to the program, and I apologize if I'm being a little hyperbolic. I'm going to try not to embarrass you too much.
You're being very flattering. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. So, well, let's just go back to how this all got started. I think, Richard, that a lot of my listeners slash viewers are on the younger side in the movement and don't know the history of the movement as much. And we're like, what I'm trying to do is to kind of learn this and bring my listeners along in real time as I start to learn about the movement. And it's been really exciting to do so. I have a lot of ignorance about the movement, and I'm just trying to catch up essentially. So take me back to those early days and how this all got started.
Well, I grew up in the countryside where I saw a lot of cruelty to animals, in shooting them and chasing them, hunting them, and farming them. And that upset me increasingly. And and then when I went to Cambridge University, I saw a lot of cruelty there in animal experiments. And it was a sort of subject that it was almost semi secret. You couldn't really talk about it. People didn't like talking about it. And eventually I came over to the States for a year and went around various universities there, and then saw further examples of cruelty to animals in experiments. And I saw a poor cat in California who'd been blinded and was put in one of these permanently rotating wheels in which it had to keep walking and depriving it of sleep. And I said to the professor, well, what is the point of this experiment? And he said, well, it's just a good practice for the students to get used to handling animals. I said, well, it seems like a very cruel way to do it. And he said, oh, you don't worry about that sort of thing. You know, America was just as bad as Britain. And of course, I quickly learned that animal experiments were common right across the world. And as I'd had special access to some of them, I felt I ought to start talking about it. There was a lot of opposition to start with. People tended to describe animal experiments as medical experiments, but only 1 in 10 was probably, strictly speaking, a medical experiment. So it was just a constant sort of disguising of what was a terrible, permanent atrocity. Millions of animals around the world being cruelly experimented upon every year. Millions of animals around the world being put into farm cages that were too small and given special foods that made them develop their bodies very quickly so that they could get slaughtered quickly, and awful scenes in slaughterhouses where thousands of animals were killed every day. There seemed to be everywhere this semi-hidden atrocity going on, affecting not human beings, but affecting our evolutionary relatives. You know, it was way back in the 50s and 60s that Charles Darwin said we're all connected, we're all related through evolution. You know, these other animals, we're animals too. Of course, there's still people who get very shocked when you try and say that human beings are animals, as if it's an insult. And of course, it's strictly speaking scientifically true to say we are all animals. Some of them that look particularly different from us and can't talk the language that we talk, they're called a different species. And so there is this terrible way that we think that human beings must be treated one way with some respect, but that animals coming from other species, you can do what you want to, more or less what you want to. You can treat them appallingly, particularly in laboratories and factory farms. And so I got more and more, after I got back from the States, actually, I tried to start writing letters to the newspapers criticizing the mistreatment of animals. And eventually I called it speciesism, which is like racism or sexism. It was a sort of permanent prejudice that affected our relationship with animals, and there was no good justification for it. I would say, you know, on what grounds do we think we can treat cows like this? On what grounds can we be cruel to lobsters and boil them alive when all the evidence is that they're highly intelligent creatures? What is it? Why am I blind? Am I talking nonsense? I actually began to think that I might be abnormal in some way. I might be having some sort of a misperception of what was going on. But I've more and more become convinced that those of us in the movement are all right. You know, we've got the right sense of shock at the way that human beings say that we are special because we're one species, and monkeys and dogs and cats and horses are all different because they're of different species to us. Who said that our species was superior to all the others? There's not a lot in the religions to suggest that. In fact, some of the Eastern religions, like Buddhism, for example, and Jainism, they say, no, we're not superior. We can suffer pain and fear and agony, and the other species too can suffer pain and fear and agony. They've got very similar nervous systems. They've got very similar parts of the brain that are involved with the experience of pain and fear. There's more and more evidence that they suffer just as we do. They might suffer worse. Some of the little ones might be suffering worse. We simply can't judge it yet. But it seems outrageous that we should take such care for other human beings, which we do, and that's admirable. And then we ignore completely monkeys and cats and dogs and all the rest, hundreds of other species of animal, big ones and little ones, and we treat them with very little respect at all. It seems to me to be quite wrong. It's an example of a big prejudice like racism, and this is what I call speciesism.
Yeah, and you coined that term. And I just want to give people some context that, the argument that you're making right now is something that animal rights activists will have heard. But you're talking about the 60s, and this was really not being talked about then. I want to share something with you that I find kind of disturbing. So I've been vegan for 8 years and in the movement for 8 years. What turned me vegan was the film Earthlings. And in the first 15 minutes or so of that film, they're describing speciesism. So it goes directly back to your influence. And what disturbs me is that you were just describing these industries as being semi-hidden. And that's what I would describe them as today. And to further that point, my background was that I spent 15 years at national public radio stations as a reporter, which is like the BBC, in America. And I had no clue that this was happening. And so I wonder, before we jump backwards and go back in time to how speciesism, like came to you, and um, how you pioneered all this, uh, do you see it as very different today? Because I just find it disturbing that I would have described it as semi-hidden right now. I realized that when I learned about it, there was a movement that I could get in, and there wasn't one really at that time. So I guess there's one difference right there. But how would you say things have changed? Um,
Yes, it's interesting. I mean, in the States and in Europe and Britain, um, there was quite a good movement from about the 1850s onwards, and there were some outstanding figures, and there were some steps taken by politicians to pass laws protecting animals more. We got one or two good laws passed in Britain, one or two good laws passed in other countries in Europe, and then some good stuff in the States. And the leaders in the States kept in touch with the British people and so on. So things were going quite well. And then the whole thing was stopped by the First World War. There was so much suffering and cruelty in the First World War to other human beings that the discussion of the subject of cruelty to animals was blotted out. And it was blotted out really throughout the 1920s and 1930s. And then after the war, people tended to be quite rightly concerned with the awful cruelties of the Second World War, and the same thing carried on. And people tried to get it going again, and it never really took off. People said, you should be putting humans first. Why are you going on about animals all the time when the human beings are suffering? Which, of course, there was a lot of uncontrolled poverty throughout the world at that time, with affecting human beings. And there was always this tendency to put the animals after human beings. And if you went on too much about animals, people would say, you've got your priorities wrong. You're concerned about other species, but they're not very intelligent and they probably don't suffer very much. And of course, all that's gone now. Science is now behind us. Science now confirms that all the other animal species suffer in a similar way to ourselves. And the thing has got going now because people don't seem to be so afraid of talking about it. But it was when I first started campaigning in the 1960s and 1970s, it was, if you went on about cruelty to animals, people thought you were a bit peculiar and they would make rude jokes about you. And that's all gone, thank goodness. And people now, supported by science and modern scientists, can see that there is a very strong argument. And of course, some of the best philosophers in the world have agreed with us. People like Peter Singer is one of the best known philosophers in the world. He's absolutely 100% behind us. And it's very important that people should know that. And part of my job nowadays is to try to publicize people like Peter and point to their role as professional philosophers, where they say, yes, 100% we're behind it. Perhaps even more important is to get the leading scientists to agree that the modern scientist produces evidence, scientific evidence, that confirms that the other species suffer more or less in the same sort of way that we do. And that's the important thing to worry about. So there was this bad period when in the 1960s, it was difficult to start campaigning. I got involved. I came back from the States and tried to get involved and wrote letters to the newspapers, and they were published. That was good because I could say I'm a scientist and I've seen animals in laboratories. And if I could say that, that made the letters more respectable. And so we got our letters published, and then people would get in touch with me who had read the letters and so on. The snowball grew bigger and bigger. And some younger people say, well, we don't want to just specialize in rescuing lost animals or animals that needed a better home, or take animals away from people who are being cruel to them, but we need to actually go deeper and look deeper. And so the whole movement has subsequently become more political, which is a good thing, because the politicians in a democracy do show considerable concern for animal welfare, because they know that so many thousands of decent human beings who vote for them are also concerned about animals. So it's now taking off more and more. And the politicians in Britain in particular have turned out to be very good at getting legislation through to protect animals from abuse, animal abuse.
Yeah, it's sort of we're seeing some advances in America, but we're pretty behind in America when it comes to our politics, I would say, when it comes to animals. And that's on the right and the left, Democrat, Republican. They all fail animals pretty badly. So hopefully we're starting to see that change. But going back to the 60s, and you mentioned Peter Singer. You talked before about this kind of feeling that you had. Am I crazy? Is there something wrong with me that I have this concern? And I've seen in, previous interviews that you've given that you sort of started to, like you mentioned this, you started talking about it. And then you came to learn that there were others, people like Peter, who shared your concern. And you suddenly realized you weren't alone in this. And then there were people who had a desperate passion for animals, which must have felt great for you, because, I mean, again, it's hard for me to even imagine that there's not even at that point like a movement. There's not really much, or, correct me if I'm wrong, because I wasn't there, but it just seems like it must have felt very lonely at the time.
Yes, it did feel lonely sometimes. It was because the two world wars, again, had knocked the stuffing out of the movement that was beginning 100 years ago.
Right.
And it had never recovered from that. I mean, the big organizations like the RSPCA, the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, which exists in Britain, they were struggling a bit. And the smaller animal organizations, many of them had just gone bankrupt and folded up. Some of them were still continuing as charities, but they weren't making a lot of progress. That's true. And we needed a different attitude. We needed to be, everyone would say, oh, that's for women, and men were very scathing about it. Oh, well, women are concerned about those sort of things. They didn't want to do anything that suggested that they were being like women. And,
I wish that had changed. You said
yes,
that those things had changed. I'm not sure. When you said that, I was like, I'm not sure how much has changed, at least in America. There's
no,
still a lot of that.
well, maybe we are still leading the way in Europe. I mean, in Europe now, there's some very good organizations. Interestingly enough, I learned recently that one of the countries in Europe that was considered to be the most backward in kindness to animals, Spain, got a lot of bad publicity from the media in Europe. This is about 20 years ago. Bullfighting, but not only bullfighting, the treatment of farm animals, the slaughtering, inadequate, inhumane slaughtering, etc., etc. Spain got constant criticism. And as a result, some people in Spain got together and there's been a revolution in Spain. Spain, which was regarded as one of the cruelest nations to animals, has now become one of the most advanced. And it's all happened in about 20 years. And it's very interesting that it suddenly takes off. And they're still arguing about it. They're trying to abolish bullfighting. I mean, can you imagine that? Spain have been crazy about bullfighting for 100 years or more. And that's now threatened. And I heard it recently being discussed by a government minister from Spain whose job is animal welfare. He's a government minister. And I said to him, well, how do you explain this sudden revolution in Spain? And he said, it was our women. It was our women who told the men to stop going on thinking they were tough all the time when all they were doing was actually being cruel to animals who couldn't defend themselves.
Right.
And so that led to a very rapid change in Spain, which sounds absolutely wonderful. The fact that there is a government minister in Spain, of all countries, dedicated to animal welfare is a wonderful change, unimaginable 30 years ago. And I think things can happen quite quickly because it's just like a lot of people haven't got round to imagining the changes brought by science. Science itself has brought more and more evidence that the human species is not entirely different from all the other species. We've got better, on the whole, we're a bit more intelligent and we speak a lot. We communicate very well. Those are the sort of differences that are certainly there. But then there's evidence that other animals can suffer the loss of friends. When their friends die, they go into a state of mourning. When they listen to good music, they seem to become very involved with it. There's all sorts of signs that actually animals, although they can't talk our language, they can think remarkably similar to us. And those people that have a close relationship with a dog or a cat, for example, close relationship with pets, they know that these animals think a lot more than people give them credit for. They think and they suffer, and they have remarkable similarities with us, really. And I think people can now accept this. It was that halfway route to science that left us uncertain which way to go. Now everyone is becoming better educated scientifically. They're actually able to see that and believe what science is telling them, that these animals have got similar parts of the brain that are concerned about such things as pain. They, in many ways, have similar instincts. They have very similar behavior. They enjoy the company of human beings. I get the feeling that so many animals are wanting to have a good, friendly relationship with human beings. And they're very often just met with rifle barrels and exploitation of one sort or another.
They are. And, this sort of gets back to this speciesism. And you've described during this time period that, and I had no idea about this, that just the newness, how new even the terms racism and sexism were at that time. So I've heard you describe this, that you wondered, why are the animals being left out of this? We're seeing an arbitrary distinction being made based on things that aren't really morally relevant. Just
No,
a
they're not
different
morally
body.
justified, certainly. I mean, obviously, it's very convenient being able to boil up lobsters in saucepans and eating them because they taste good, but that's not a moral justification for being cruel to them. And there are so many examples of this where the argument is very, very weak. And this is why having people like Peter Singer come along and put forward the very high-powered professional philosophical arguments. And I think more and more people see that this is the case now. Intelligent people at universities are beginning to see that this is logically completely wrong to go on saying we've got a right. Where did the right come from? Who invented it? How did they invent it? In fact, there's a bit in the Bible, that human beings are in some ways superior to the other animals. But who invented that attitude? It seems to have been some priests about 1,000 years BC, perhaps. Nobody knows their name. They didn't have any evidence. Obviously, they couldn't produce any scientific evidence because they didn't have much science at the time. And what we really want is real evidence. If we're going to be cruel to a group of other creatures, well, then we need to have some really good evidence justifying it, and we don't have that evidence.
You've mentioned Peter Singer a few times. I had gotten one of your books where you're talking about speciesism and painism, and the foreword was written by Peter Singer. So I knew you guys had a close friendship, a close bond, and I was fortunate enough to, be in contact through email with Peter Singer, and Peter is the one who made this introduction and got us in touch. And I just want to say about Peter, what a lovely guy he is, and so professional and helpful. But take us back, because I've since learned, and people credit Animal Liberation, his defining book, as launching the animal rights movement. Now, I've heard from your story, it sounds to me that Animal Liberation was written basically because he had written a review of a previous book that you had written, which got lauded, and then that sort of led to him writing Animal Liberation.
Yes, he's 6 years younger than me, so he's a little bit. He was always a little bit behind in that sense. That when we were starting to do things in Oxford, before Peter got there, we started. The movement was geeing itself up and becoming more scientific and more philosophical. And I was part of that group in the late 1960s, early 1970s. And then Peter comes over to England from the States. Actually, he's Australian originally, Peter Singer. And then he did some work in the States at a university. And then he came over to Oxford to do some work there. And he heard about all this argument going on in Oxford at that time, 1970, 71, 72, that sort of time. There was a lot of argument going on between the scientists and the philosophers and other people in the street. What were we doing to animals? Did we have a right to treat them in the way that we did, to farm them in the horrible conditions, kill them in bad slaughterhouses where they weren't killed cleanly? Everything. We were exploiting the other species, and this became a topic of conversation. And when Peter arrived from Australia, he heard it, and that's where he first really heard it as a topic of debate. And he naturally got fascinated by it, became drawn into it. And the first I knew of Peter Singer was when he telephoned me in, I think, 1971, and said, "I've heard about your word speciesism. Can we get together and talk about it? I would want to hear what you have to say." So he came over to my house, and I explained to him what I thought speciesism was about, and he got very excited by it. And he actually, a few weeks later, said to me, "I've got a commission from publishers in America to publish a book on the subject. Would you be co-author of it?" Well, of course, initially I accepted for a few days, and then I realized I was so damn busy doing all the other things, because I had a full-time job in a hospital as well at the same time. And so I said to Peter, I can't do it, particularly as I've not done any philosophy before, and I'll have to keep on looking things up in textbooks if I'm going to work as your co-author. And so reluctantly, I withdrew from that. A pity. It was a silly thing to do. I should have done it. And it would have been much more fun. But there we are. So he wrote this excellent book. I gave him some of the material for it. But he writes with such clarity, and he speaks with such clarity, that he's, of course, become a very important figure. And he's actually worked a lot of the time back in the States and at Princeton, which do I mean? Princeton. And he has kept in touch with me, and I've kept in touch with him. And this contact with you is an example of us working together. Sometimes I send his name and address to other journalists who want to talk to them. But he's a wonderful man, and he's become one of the leading figures in philosophy worldwide now. He's
Yeah.
regarded as one of the greatest living philosophers. And it's mainly because he can speak with absolute clarity and with absolute authority about modern and indeed not so modern schools of philosophy. He's got it all under his thumb. He knows what he's
Yeah.
talking about when it comes to philosophy.
Well, so one of the reasons why at the very beginning I said this all kind of traces back to you, Richard, not only because of speciesism, but I've started to hear now from some of the older folks in the movement who have, just, been so influential. Uh, they have cited your book, Victims of Science, more. I started to hear that book's name more and more. And then I heard that it was a review that Peter Singer had written for that book that was very lauded by the New York, what did I write it down? The
New York book,
New York Review of Books.
New York
Yeah.
Review of Books. That's right.
Who
Yes.
was very
Yes.
impressed by that. And then that's what led them to commission him to writing Animal Liberation. Now I've heard numerous people, including Ingrid Newkirk and a lot of people who cite animal liberation as the defining thing that started them. And so it traces back to you, which I think is extraordinary. And like you just said, you were almost the co-author of this animal liberation. So this history to me is just something I've come across in the last, like I said, in the last few months, and it's extraordinary. One of my goals has been with this channel is to lately it's sort of morphed into like trying to make sure we don't overlook aspects of our history that are being overlooked. And I think that may be one of the aspects of it that is being overlooked. So I want to say thank you, because you're why I'm here, I think. And like I said, I don't mean to say that hyperbolically. I know it can be a little embarrassing, but I think that's true. I really do think that's true. And correct me if I'm wrong. Yeah.
Oh, well, thank you very much. You're very kind. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, tell me a little bit. Yeah. So this is funny to me. I've also heard you say that you came up with speciesism while you were in the bath. You were in the bathtub at the time.
Yes, that was about 1967 or something. I was having a bath, and I was. Oh no! Wait a minute. It was 1968 when there was a lot of interest in human rights, and there was a big convention in Paris, and one of my friends, Hugh Denman, went to it. There were thousands of people there, and it was very good. Every branch, every consideration of human exploitation, and I mean exploitation of humans, were considered, and a lot of resolutions were passed and so on. And no mention, he said, no mention of animal rights at all. Despite the fact that it was very publicized worldwide, no mention of animal rights. There were just the sort of people there who tended to sort of laugh if you mentioned animal rights. They thought it was something funny about it. It was something for funny old ladies to be concerned about. Eventually, of course, the funny old ladies were proved to be absolutely right in logical terms and in scientific terms. And so we should apologize to the old ladies who were trying to maintain some interest in the abuse of animals.
I'm curious as to why you were not deterred, because you said you were getting all this opposition. This wasn't really a thing at the time. I just wonder, like, you must have felt this very intensely to be able to, to start writing these letters and all of that, and to be sort of a lone wolf at the time. There was nobody else, to your knowledge, really doing this stuff. I know you've cited some great philosophers that you came to after the fact, like Jeremy Bentham and that sort of thing after the fact. But you were sort of, leading your own charge, it sounds to me.
I was a fairly lonely boy living in the
mm,
countryside, not near to other buildings or human beings. And I used to think about the problems of the universe.
mm,
And that sounds rather pompous to say that, but I mean, I used to think deeply about things. And the only person I could discuss this with was my father's dog, Toby. So he
mm,
used to have to sit there in the middle of the countryside while I spoke to him about the problems of whatever it was, atom bombs and all the rest of it.
mm,
And it, it I eventually worked out that I wanted to know what morality was. Why should it be special? And so on. These difficult questions. And I eventually concluded that it was all based upon causing suffering to others. Or suffering just happening. I mean, nature is full of cruelty. People get ill and they get sick and they suffer as a result, and animals do the same. And I thought, well, that's at least we know what the central issue is. The central issue is pain. Pain to mean not just a toothache, but fear and in feeling inferior, feeling lost, any sort of bad thing that causes pain is wrong, particularly if you deliberately inflict it upon someone else that can feel pain, not just human beings, but anything that can feel pain. Maybe some robots can feel pain. Maybe some people from outer space, some creatures from outer space that we one day encounter will be able to suffer pain, in which case they must be given a moral code too. And the moral codes should all be much the same thing. There should not be very much difference between the way that one painient individual suffers and another. A cow and a human being can both suffer the same sort of pain, and they both deserve the similar sort of protections in the law. This is the sort of position I got to before I went to Cambridge University, where I then met some interesting, intelligent people, and found that there was already some interest in the idea. And it was difficult to talk about animal rights at that stage. I had two outstanding older friends at the university, Richard Gregory, Professor Richard Gregory, and Professor, what's his name? Crick,
mm,
the famous Professor Crick. And they were very interested in, I was also very interested in consciousness, how consciousness is created by the brain cells in our brains and by other bits of us, and perhaps by other things we don't know of. And Crick, well, Gregory thought it was something to do with growing more complex. Anything that became increasingly complex, like our brains, just sort of automatically give birth to this extraordinary state of consciousness. Whereas Crick thought, no, it's just consciousness, just like any other difficult physical condition. It just needs to be dealt with in conventional science, and we'll crack it eventually. And so he got given a huge amount of money to do that in California, actually. And he
mm,
didn't get to the answer, nor eventually did Richard Gregory get to the answer. So these very, very brilliant men was finding it impossible to really crack the question of what is consciousness. But of course, without consciousness, you can't have pain that is morally significant, in my opinion. So it led on to those sort of problems. We've never found a real explanation for consciousness, but there's a lot more known about pain, how that operates using the brain cells and the other brains we have in our body. And there is a similarity between all animals. Now, what is the question I'm originally trying to...
Well, I think it was sort of like how you were so committed to this, and I feel like I just got to that a little bit when you talked about how you felt lonely, and under your definition of pain, loneliness would qualify.
Oh,
So,
yes, indeed.
yeah, so like sort of any negative feeling would qualify as
Yes,
pain. So
yes, that's right.
perhaps you just understood it better and could empathize better.
Well, then I got to Cambridge, that's right. The little bit I got to Cambridge, I then realized people began to mention this chap, Jeremy Bentham. And I began to read him up and found that really he got there already 100 years before me. And I went with my friend Barbara and we visited his body is preserved at the University College London. And so we went to visit him, and there's a photograph of us all together that Barbara took in my new book, which Barbara published yesterday.
Oh, wow.
But I had to admit that Jeremy Bentham had got there before me, and he called it utilitarianism. And that really is the position that Peter Singer takes. I have a slight difference with them. I don't think it's possible to add up lots of separate people's pains. You can add up the pains within a person, within an animal, but you can't add up one animal's pains and add it up to the other animals and make a score that really means something. So that's the slight difference that I have with utilitarianism. Otherwise, I had just reinvented utilitarianism. And because I was a psychologist and not a philosopher, I hadn't been taught that Bentham had already said a lot of this. And Bentham is good and very good, and he needs to be the pillar of the basis of this new movement for animal rights, I think.
You know, I've met a lot of activists now from the UK, and there's just a different kind of energy in the UK that I've seen. So many great activists. That's not to say that America doesn't have great activists. They do.
Yes.
But I've often asked my guests from the UK, what is it about the UK that just seems to be fertile ground for these
Yes,
activists?
I think people do love animals. And they've got a habit of writing letters to their MPs saying, why can't you do more about animals? And they've been doing that for 50 years or so. And it's still getting stronger. I mean, at the moment, we're going through a bad patch when our economy is not good. The world is fighting 2 wars. And it's always on those occasions that animal welfare tends to fade a bit. The situation in the States is obviously different from the democratic status of everything in Britain and in other countries in Europe. I mean, Germany is very good at animal welfare. The Scandinavian countries are very good. And a lot of other countries are getting better and better. And Spain is the latest example. So it is going well. I think the media took an effort to realize that they ought to be taking it seriously. And it happened quite suddenly, actually, in 1975. A friend of mine, Clive Hollands, and I used to try and get stories into the media. And it was always a bit of a hard slog. And then stories began to appear on their own. And we discovered that at last, editors of newspapers, for example, were realizing that this was a subject that interested their readers. So they began to say, don't make fun of it. Don't go out and try and make jokes about it. Try and take it seriously. So people began to take it seriously. And of course, it's been justified because people are interested. They read a story in the newspaper or on television, they see a story. They actually are concerned about it. and they become
Mhm.
quite big issues, which is good because it shows that we are, in our hearts, we're all Darwinians. We've accepted the idea that really we're all part of the same creation. It's been a slow creation through the process of evolution, and
Yeah.
that's what we all are increasingly aware of. That the animals, dogs, cats, horses, you name it, um, caterpillars, they're all part of something which is called life. And they've all got increasingly evidence to show that they can feel pain and suffer in the same sort of way that we do. And this is becoming very much more acceptable today than it is. I think the problem in the States is that, the States is very big. And
For
what
sure.
happens politically at one end of the States hasn't been heard of on the other end of the States. I mean, I
Mhm.
found that when I was working in the States. There's a lot of very local news factories and newspapers and television channels, and nothing really big. Of course, also in Britain, we've got the BBC, one
Mhm.
big television channel and another big television channel, and that's about it. We don't have hundreds that exist in the States. And um, the I've done very little bit of lobbying in Washington, and I found the senators and representatives actually very interested in animal welfare, but they didn't seem to have anything obvious they could do about it. It was too
Mhm.
big a subject. You had to get the machines of the Democratic Party and the machine of the Republican Party interested in this, but the machines were too big. They were churning on with great issues to do with the world peace and whether or not they could win the next presidential election. And for some reason, the machine doesn't work as sensitively in the USA as it does in Britain. Where in Britain, you've got 600 members of parliament, and all of them will say to you they get more letters about animal welfare and animal rights than they do about anything to do with human beings.
Hmm.
And they used to laugh at it and say how ridiculous these women were who wrote to them. And I would say to them, well, you may say they're just women, and that's a pretty old-fashioned view and a pretty disgraceful view, in my opinion. Um, but they still have votes.
Mhm.
You've got to
Yeah.
watch it. And of course, there were some MPs who realized initially that they could get some more votes from it. And the recent scientific research in Britain suggests that, yes, you can win it. You should be able to win elections on animal votes. Um, no MP has really tried to do it completely in Britain. I don't think they've done it cynically at all. I think actually quite a lot of politicians in Britain are good people. They're good men and women. They actually want to help, and they actually do like animals. And hundreds of recently, we managed to outlaw the hunting of animals for fun and the killing of foxes, particularly chasing them and killing them with packs of dogs. And it took about 13 years for us to get that made illegal. But it was a sign that even a subject that was very much supported by a small group of wealthy people with lots of money to support them, and lots of influence politically to support it, they eventually had to give way to ordinary public opinion in Britain.
Mhm.
There were just, for every letter that the Prime Minister received from a hunting person who wanted to preserve hunting, he'd get 5 or 6 from ordinary members of the public saying it's cruel. I want it stopped. It's wrong that people should be deliberately cruel to animals. And they're not even eating them. They're just chasing them for fun and all that. So it was very gratifying. Our system is more sympathetic, I think, as a democracy, a small democracy, than the great big United States. There's something that isn't able to pick up these softer feelings.
Yeah, I think it's just a theory because I don't know and I think about it a lot, but perhaps the size that you mentioned as a possible culprit could be. And I will say that our media just doesn't figure it out. Because the same phenomenon is true in America. Animal stories go haywire. They get a lot of attention. In fact, recently we had this major win where this beagle breeder, Richland Farms, announced that they were going to be shutting down. One of the big reasons why this happened, and there's a lot of reasons, but one reason is that there was a lot of media attention in the last few months. This local reporter based in Madison, Wisconsin, was just on it, and the reason why he was on it was because he was getting a ton of attention for the stories, and people kept promoting it. I had on an investigator named Gail Eisnitz on my channel who had gotten something published in the Washington Post decades ago, and it became like one of their most read pieces. But sadly, there's just a handful of publications, one being the UK Guardian, who also, reports in America, that actually covers the topic, which is very sad. And I wish that our media would get on the ball. And again, as someone who used to be in the media, it's like I have a bit of shame because I was part of this. I was part of the ignorance about it. And I think that that is one of the things is that, and that gets back to this, it's semi-hidden. It should be out there, but it's not. It's like people aren't thinking about it because it's not in our face every day.
Yes, yes, that's right. That's right. But I've met these genuine guys in Washington who were, I can't remember their names now, Senator this and that, and they were genuinely interested in animals. They all had pets of various sorts, and they loved them. And they could see, yes, they didn't like it when someone who could claim to be a bit of a scientist could say to them, there's more and more evidence that actually the nervous system and the way that pain is mediated in the body through the nervous system is really the same throughout the animal kingdom, almost the same. Obviously, there are some extreme examples, but they are beginning to accept it. And it's been the MPs who've actually the MPs of the House of Commons, the elected people, not the people who got appointed to the House of Lords so much, but the people in the House of Commons who've been very good people at picking up small, genuine issues involving, well, it's in as much as people worry about the cruelty to animals, it's causing them pain too. So human beings are being affected. And then we produce this little bit of evidence from Maury polls that there seemed to be some scientific evidence that people were prepared to change their vote towards the other party, not the one they usually vote for, if that party showed a determination to be kind to animals and introduce new legislation to protect animals in farms or whatever it was.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the mistakes that I see people make in our movement, and it's understandable, because I too feel very cynical about politicians, but I see a lot of people just kind of write all of them off as just bad people.
Yes.
And I used to cover state politics for a long time, so I met a lot of these politicians. Now I know you've met a lot of politicians, and I'm sure you and I agree that you meet good people. There are good people in politics. And it's totally understandable to be cynical about the whole process, and to overall be distrusting of politicians. But there are some good ones. I've met quite a few of them on both sides of the aisle, in fact.
Yes, yes. I think the time has come to celebrate those good politicians that we have. I'm sure on
Right.
both sides of the Atlantic we have good politicians as mixed in with ones that aren't quite so good, and we actually want to encourage them to do the decent, kindly thing, and that is stand up for animals. I think it's time has come to say well done to the good politicians. And my book which deals with the ban on hunting with hounds. I don't know whether you want to talk about that
Yeah, and
more.
in fact, I wanted to do that right now because I feel bad that we're almost an hour in and I haven't gotten to your book. The conversation was flowing so naturally, but I wanted to mention,
Can you see
and
it?
that is a beautiful cover, by the way.
I
That's
think
really
so too.
nice.
It's Barbara. Barbara did it.
Did you say that this was published just yesterday, so you can get it on Amazon now? Is that right?
You speak up. 8th of December. 8th of December.
8th of December. Wonderful.
I think
That's
that's
perfect.
tomorrow or something.
Okay, great. Well, this won't publish today, so it might be published tomorrow. So that would be great.
Yes.
So I did want to make the point before we got into the book, just that one of the things that I love about you and how this whole movement started as an intellectual movement. Whereas a lot, some people view the movement as anti-science or anti-intellectual. Quite the opposite. It had a lot of intellectual heft behind it, but you weren't just an intellectual. You weren't just someone talking about philosophy and psychology. I know you're psychologist. You were a real boots on the ground guy doing a lot of campaigning, a lot like you described hunt sabbing and doing that kind of stuff. So you got your hands dirty a lot, and
Yes.
I'm glad. It sounds to me like this new book deals some with that, about all of these campaigns. So that's a great segue for us to talk about your new book, which I'm very excited about.
Good.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit about that book. It's called The Ban
Okay.
on Hunting with Hounds and Other Campaigns Against Speciesism. So it gets right back to that heart of speciesism.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Do you like me holding it up?
It's beautiful. Yeah. Let's just see it
Good.
again. Yeah. That's fantastic. Yeah. So
All
I hope
Barbara's work.
everybody will get this. Yeah.
All Barbara's work.
And by
Anyway.
the way, and before you talk about that, you've written a lot of books. There's a lot of books out. I mentioned Victims of Science having a huge impact on early animal rights people, and but you've also written about speciesism and painism that we've kind of delved into a little bit too. So there's a wealth of information out there for people. But yeah, let's talk about the new one here.
Yes. Well, it's probably my last book because I'm well into my 80s now, and I don't think I can go on writing books. But this was just I was asked by other people when we won this battle to stop fox hunting, to stop fox hunting animals, wild animals with dogs. It was a very hard fight, and it took 13 years. Because the pro-hunting people, the people who actually were hunting, very often were rich people with influence in politics, and included a lot of lawyers. And it made it very difficult to get this. But it was because the Labour members of Parliament in the House of Commons were so keen on actually getting some legislation passed that eventually we managed to do it. But it was a question of putting animals into politics. And that's one of the messages of the book, really. It's 2 or 3 of us got together and constantly tried to meet with senior politicians. And eventually we were meeting with prime ministers and leaders of political parties and talking about what their program was going to be on animal welfare. So the parties now in Britain have all got programs dealing with the treatment of animal welfare. They won't necessarily use the term animal rights, but it is being used now quite frequently in serious political documents. And it's now accepted by the younger generation of British politicians as being legitimately part of ordinary politics. That's one of the big breakthroughs. I've just was rung up by people 3 years ago when I thought I'd retired, and they said, but we must hear more about the successful campaign to stop hunting with dogs. And because you're the last person still alive who was a member of the core group. So I've written the book because I was given that incentive. And then at the same time, other people began writing to me and saying, we ought to have your autobiography because
Yeah.
you've been campaigning for animals for 50 years and we haven't got a proper record of that. Well, of course, I can't just remember it because there's just too much. So, but what I have done in the second half of this book is talk about me for a bit. And so it's a strange sort of mixture of a book. One about a very big campaign that took 13 years and involved thousands of people, and the other, a more personal description of my life, and
Mm,
particularly from the political point of view and from
mm.
the animal protection point of view. So
Yeah.
that's what it is.
Well, I love that you said I thought I was retired, but then they came calling. So I hope you realize we're not going to let you retire, Richard.
That's a good saying. We've got distinguished people here, not just Barbara Gardner's name on the cover, but
Mm,
we've got Professor Peter Singer, Chris Packham. Have you heard of him in the States? Yes, you
absolutely.
know
Yeah.
him.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
he's backing it, and Sir Brian May, the Queen.
Well,
Barbara, can
that
you
name I
explain?
don't know.
Queen guitarist. Yes.
Mm. You know, we have a similar goal, Richard, that,
Hmm.
it sounds to me like, I've mentioned how, there are aspects of our movement that I think are overlooked. And I saw that you bring up this name a lot, Brian Davies. And I
Oh,
remember
Brian
you,
Davis. Yes.
yeah, I remember you were asking a kind of a room and that during this talk, have you guys heard of Brian Davies? And nobody really said anything. You were like, that's a real shame. Um,
Yes.
so I went and looked him up. Sound like an extraordinary guy, but tell me who Brian Davies was and why we should remember him.
Yes. Well, he was born in Wales, um, was rejected by his mother, um, and came back from school one day and found that she wasn't there, and there was just a note saying she'd gone away, and she hoped he'd have a good life. And he was 15, I think. He was 15, and he then emigrated to Canada and went into the Canadian Army. And in the Canadian Army, he got to see the killing of seals, which goes on every year in Canada. And he disliked it so much that he decided to get out of the army and set up his own animal welfare outfit. And he discovered then that he had got a natural flair for politics and for fundraising. And so he raised millions of dollars. Oh, there he is. There's a picture of him. Barbara's holding it for you to see. Can you
Oh,
see it?
yeah, that's great. Is that from your book?
Yes.
Wow.
That's
Yeah.
him. Oh,
With the
sorry.
seal.
That's him with a seal
Yeah.
about 10 years ago.
Yeah.
He died 2 years ago.
Yeah.
Um, anyway, he had money and he wanted to, he could raise millions, literally, of dollars and of pounds. He got a lot of money in Britain. He used to come back regularly to Britain and to visit his home in Wales. And he was modern. He got himself taught to fly aeroplanes and to fly helicopters, and he'd fly helicopters into places like the Gulf of St. Lawrence. He would get into jungles, and he would constantly raise money for this. And people saw that he was an active man. He was doing something for the
Mm,
animals, and he got money because of that. And they trusted him, and they were right to, because he would take out presidents. He could give a donation to the party, and then he'd take them out to dinner. and then they would reciprocate and take him out to dinner, and the wife would come along. Mrs. Marcos came along and saw these pictures of dogs being mistreated in the Philippines, and she ordered her husband immediately to make this illegal, and he wrote a diktat immediately and sent it off while he was having dinner with Brian, and
Wow.
make it illegal. And then Brian read it and found that he'd made it a capital punishment.
Yeah.
And so he had to spend an hour persuading President Marcos to reduce the penalty.
Oh,
He said
wow.
he was very much obliged, but could he reduce the penalty? Anyway, so he was a very successful operator, and he did it completely differently. He did it in a sort of extrovert, manly sort of way. He was funny. He was often depressed. He was highly intelligent. And he and his beautiful wife, Gloria, used to fly around the world meeting important people. And they did a lot to stop this exploitation of seals worldwide. And then they went on to other animals, usually wild animals, elephants, etc. And he was getting interested more and more in animal experimentation and farm animals. It's a pity that he died, but he was getting on, I suppose. He was late 80s. And I knew him very well by the end. I knew him for 30 years, I think. Great man. And his organization, the International Fund for Animal Welfare, still exists, although it's been taken over by not obviously the same sort of person.
I see.
But he got interested in my organization, which was the RSPCA, that is the biggest animal welfare organization in Britain and claims to be the biggest in the world. And we've managed to get the RSPCA during my time to become more political, more of a campaigning organization. And Brian Davis helped us and showed them what you could do with helicopters and what you could do with large amounts of money, which you could donate to people. I mean, he was cynical about money. He was a left-wing politician, slightly left-wing, but he thought, if I can use money to actually help the animals, then money will be doing something worthwhile. And that's how he lived his life. And he was a great success.
You answered two of my questions right there, which was, I'd heard you talking about the political donations, and I was wondering where the money came from. So it came from Brian's fundraising.
Brian Davis. Yeah.
Right. And then also I'd heard this story about the dictator, but I didn't know it was the Philippines. And I was curious, who was the dictator?
Marcos, Mr. and Mrs. Marcos. And it's very often the wife who may have got scandals of her own, but she nearly always, if she's there with Brian and Gloria, seeing these photographs of animals suffering, she wants to get it stopped. And when Brian says, but it's taking place in your country, Mrs. What I've forgotten her name.
Marcos.
Marcos, thank you, Marcos. Yeah. Marcos. Then she was very upset, and it was important to make it personal. He had exactly the right touch. I think if he'd started a bit earlier, perhaps he would have become a president of something himself.
Yeah. Well, what an extraordinary sounding guy. You mentioned the RSPCA, and I'm curious because it sounds like you've had a real positive influence on them. You also have talked about this group, Eurogroup for Animal Welfare, and they seem to have had a huge impact. But I'm wondering, what do you think about this? I'm sure you heard about the RSPCA expose that Animal Rising did, where they exposed all these farms. They went to all these farms and exposed these RSPCA approved farms. And the goal was and Chris Packham, I think, left the RSPCA over this.
Yes.
He Yeah, the goal is to get them to stop the certifying these farms. What do you think of that campaign?
Well, I'm behind it. I've always very critical of the RSPCA's campaign to work with other companies, because I didn't feel we were big enough to do it competently. And
Mm,
sure enough, it turned out that some of them were cheating. The RSPCA didn't deliberately go with these people who wanted to take the credit for things they hadn't done. Um, and they should have actually stopped a lot of these um, awards. What were they called? You know, when you give it an award, certifications from the
right, right.
RSPCA.
Yeah.
They should have stopped them and started again. And among others, they wouldn't have lost Chris
Chris Packham, yeah.
Packham,
Yeah.
and I'm bad on names. Sorry.
It's
Um,
okay.
and the whole thing was badly handled, I think, by an
Mm,
otherwise very good CEO, who's now gone, and the RSPCA's got a new CEO. I was 50 years on the RSPCA, and I ended up as its president.
mm,
But I retired, perhaps luckily, just before this big row came
mm,
out. I wasn't a bit surprised. I wrote to the CEO saying, use this opportunity to stop this associations with the dodgy companies, and start from a clean sheet. Do it again.
mm,
And he didn't. He didn't want to do that.
mm,
But he was, in other respects, a good guy. I mean, the RSPCA has had a lot of trouble over the years, mostly with the conservative elements on it. They want its respectability for themselves. They don't really want, because it was associated always with the members of the royal family as
mm.
well, and still is. The king is the patron. And so it's been difficult to try and get it moving again and campaigning. Its founders were really grassroots people like William Wilberforce in the 1820s, who were very good. They were anti-slavery people, and they set up this thing for animals too. The anti-slavery movement and mentality went with the anti-cruelty to animals movement and its mentality, and still does. It's still about slavery and abuse of
Mm.
living creatures. And they were all anti-slavers, the early founders of the RSPCA, and they've had some very good people, but there's always been some flies in the ointment. There's always been very conservative people and people trying to do it for their own benefits and so on. So it's an ongoing story, the RSPCA. At the moment, it's looking better. There's been a good election of a woman with some experience of working for the government,
Mhm.
and we just hope that it continues and continues with its putting animals into politics, which I'd sort of drummed into it or tried to drum into.
Yeah. Yeah, I
Uh,
wish I'm kind of jealous that we didn't have you in America because I feel like that's really lacking in America. Um, is this group, the Euro group, is that part of the RSPCA? Because it sounds like a very effective wing of it. If
it
it,
is. It is.
yeah.
I mean, I set it up
Mhm,
because we needed money. Eurogroup needed money, and the RSPCA had some money. We have an income of millions of pounds a year, and so I managed to get, for about 15 years or so, I managed to get um, most of the expenses for Eurogroup paid for by the RSPCA. And then some of the Conservatives um, managed to get a majority on the council to stop it.
oh,
And
really?
Eurogroup had to struggle to get money from other sources, which was quite difficult for them. I suppose the RSPCA, Barbara might know, because Barbara was treasurer of the RSPCA nationally, a very good treasurer.
Mm.
that some of the money um, from the RSPCA is getting back to Eurogroup by now.
They're paying their share.
Yes, they're paying a share anyway. Yes, yes,
Oh, that's
yes,
good. That's good. I
yes,
mean, it sounds to me, and again, I've learned about some of this stuff just in the last few months, so I have a lot of
yes,
ignorance, but it sounds to me like they were incredibly effective. Yeah, you've cited before dozens and dozens of laws that have been passed across the EU. Um, over 50, I believe, including I think
yes,
12 you mentioned in Great Britain. Um, that's extraordinary.
yes,
The
yes. That's right. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
And
yeah.
anybody who's worked on a law or a bill or anything like that, whether you're in US or Australia or wherever, it's hard to do that.
Yes, I think
So,
it's harder in the States, and I don't fully understand the reasons, but it's harder in the
yeah.
States, I think. Um, but we've done quite well, and that one was the real test because, as I said, there was a tendency for lawyers and other people with money to
Mm,
become fox hunters. They saw it as it's a form of snobbery. They thought it made their standing more impressive.
yeah.
I don't know whether there's something equivalent in the States. It probably isn't fox hunting, but it might be having a yacht or something like that.
Right, right.
Status
Um,
symbols.
Yeah, status symbols. Yeah. Well, you've mentioned retirement, that you thought you were retired a couple of years ago, and then maybe you're re-retired after this book or something. I'm guessing that since you've been writing sort of an autobiography with this latest book to some extent,
Yes.
if you've been thinking a lot lately about legacy and like, how looking back at your lengthy and storied career and what are the moments that you feel so good about, the moments that you feel like I wish we had done this, and your legacy. I wonder if you think about your legacy and how you want people to view your legacy.
Oh gosh. Well, I just hope they carry on putting animals into politics and getting the politicians interested
Hmm.
and seeing that there's really no reason why they shouldn't be interested.
Right.
Nobody says that it's just one species that deserves all the politics and the good work. I mean, the other animals aren't quite clever enough to do it.
Hmm.
Um, but no, I hope it continues. I hope that size of the work continues. I mean, I managed to set up
Hmm.
Eurogroup,
Hmm.
which I did set against a lot of managed to set up against a lot of opposition um, in the RSPCA board as it was then. We had a huge board, mostly composed of um, slightly conservative people who some of them were possibly pro fox hunting. Um, a few were, but I think it was more just a natural human love of conservatism. You've got some people like that in the States, I know. And that was what I was fighting against. But I hope that continues. I hope the league, the more political side of the work continues because I think there's an awful lot to be done still. Now, can I
Right.
hand over to Barbara because I think I'm running out of steam.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I just want to say, just thank you so much. And, we'll bring you back if you want to continue at some point. We can
I'd
always
love to.
do
Yes,
another
yes,
interview
yes.
or something.
And you can probably think of ways in which you can do something with my book.
Yeah,
But then you can always
absolutely.
discuss that with Barbara because she understands it much better than I do. She understands computers and things like that, which I'm afraid
Yeah.
I'm a bit too old for. It's
Well, I
been
hope
very nice
that
meeting you.
you as well. And I hope that people will now like kind of understand your important role in the movement. And I just want to say thank you again.
Well,
It's a real honor to meet you.
that's very, very kind of you. Very, very kind of you. Thank you very much.